I'm going to talk about, our theme is knowledge intensification. And I was delighted when Franco invited me to come to this event, not least because I want to hear what Crime Pop and the other speakers have to say, and your experience here in Italy with this, because I have a feeling that some of what I'm going to say, I'm preaching to the converted, that you already know these lessons. This set of ideas I'm wanting to present here, I think what we're all confronting is what in English we refer to as the valley of death between the research community and farming or land management. How do we get the knowledge and the ideas that we're pouring out of the research institutes in Europe but around the world too into practice on farms? And what are the connections? And in a way, one of the messages I want to put over is that I think some of the language that we're using could be an obstruction to this process rather than a help. And this is the reason why I'm going to focus a lot in my presentation here on the word sustainable. Because in some ways I think we're abusing the word, and my diagnosis is that part of the reason why we've been discussing the environmental management of agricultural land for at least 25 years and not making very much progress with it. And I think part of this reason is and partly that is due to the language we're using. Now, I hope in the course of this presentation you'll be clear on what I'm trying to say here. So I'm going to start by explaining what I think the phrase sustainable intensification means and where it's come from and how it applies in Europe, because that's the phrase from which knowledge intensification is building. So I want to start there. I want to particularly make the point that even if we accept, and I don't know whether you all do, even if you accept that sustainable intensification describes the development path for global, including European agriculture in future years and decades, even if we accept this idea, it doesn't tell you very precisely what that means to a particular farm system in any particular country or location or region. There are multiple pathways of sustainable intensification, and I want to explain that. And then where I want to get to is 2 points I want to make about knowledge intensification. One is, to my mind, a research gap, and I want to debate that with you and get your reactions to it. You may say it's already been done, but I don't see the results. And the second is I want to talk about benchmarking farm-level environmental performance. So that's the path I want to take. Where does this phrase sustainable intensification come from? In my perspective, it starts from in the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a tremendous increase in concerns about global food security. I mean, this happened because of the commodity price spikes, the first of which was in 2007-8, and then it was repeated 2 or 3 times over the last 7 or 8 years. And this reawoke concerns that there are threats to global food security, particularly given harmful climate change that's taking place, which we don't seem to be controlling. And given the pressure of continuing population growth around the world and the economic growth that's taking place and the dietary changes that occur when countries experience economic growth. Now, that's the context out of which came the prescription that in order to feed the expanding population of the world, this would have to be done by intensifying the use of the existing global agricultural area rather than bringing new area of land into cultivation. And it seems to me that nobody is seriously contradicting that assertion, that statement, that we should sustainably intensify the existing agricultural area. Nobody's contradicting that because the presumption, which seems to be generally accepted, is that the alternative of bringing more land into cultivation will be more damaging to climate because it invariably means destroying biomass in forests or converting wetlands or grasslands into agricultural land, which produces an enormous flux of carbon into the atmosphere. So the prescription is that in terms of biodiversity destruction and climate impacts, that cultivating more land is not the way forward. We have to intensify existing land. However, that has to be done much more sustainably. And this computer's got a mind of its own. It keeps flicking on. And I make these points in the context where most agriculture in the world is economically weak. Now, feel free to contradict me. Write down if you want to contradict that assertion. I would say most European agriculture is economically weak, and most agriculture in the world is environmentally damaging. Farmers don't like that being stated, but I think it's an undeniable truth that agriculture interferes with natural systems. And therefore, to my mind, when you put these thoughts together, sustainable intensification means producing more food and more conservation outputs from the existing agricultural area, and a key to that is improving resource efficiency. Now, this is what I want to tease out. I immediately always find that when I'm making statements about sustainable intensification, given that I started the argument from food security, it's necessary to point out that dealing with global food security is not just a matter of producing more food output. Now, I strongly believe that there is as much to do about the consumption of food, and particularly on diets, both in the developing world and the developed world, because we have 1 billion undernourished and 1 billion overnourished in the world, and so that there are strong consumption challenges as well as the production challenges. However, when we talk about sustainable intensification, inherently we're talking about the sustainable intensification of agricultural production. Therefore, if I ignore consumption from here on out in this speech, it's not because I don't think it's important, it's another subject and I can't deal with everything. Sorry, this has jumped again. The policy instruments and the policy subjects that you deal with for consumption issues are very different than the policy instruments and the policy subjects when you're dealing with the intensification of agriculture and the sustainability of agriculture. So if I don't mention consumption anymore, I've now mentioned it, so I don't want to be criticised for that. Now, take that big concept, which I started at the global level, and apply it to the European Union. What's the relevance of it? Most of the additional demand in the world in the next 30 or 40 years will not arise in Europe. Europe's population, in a third of European member states, the population is already declining. In another third, it will decline in the next 10 or 15 years. By 2030, the middle projection, demographic projections of the UN are that the EU population will be declining. So this demand for additional food output is mostly a non-European affair. Also, I think we should realise that European agriculture is already amongst the most intensive in the world. I've documented that in the report for the RISE Foundation, which is referenced at the end of this report, this presentation. Also, we have to acknowledge that Europe has a high global footprint because we import large quantities of feed and beverages. The development of European agriculture in the 20th century was essentially a matter of intensifying the agricultural area that was already in cultivation at the beginning of the last century. We have not expanded our agricultural area in Europe. For the last 40 years, the agricultural area of Europe has been declining, not rising. We're not bringing forests and wetlands and grasslands into agriculture in Europe anymore. We did that several centuries ago, but that's what we're trying to prevent in some other parts of the world. But the point is that the success of European agriculture over the last century, and I do regard it as an enormous success, this intensification of agriculture has brought with it serious environmental damage. And that's the challenge, is to maintain that productivity. And I stress that we haven't reached the end of technical progress in agriculture by any means. We have to maintain that process, but we have to make a step change in the environmental performance which accompanies it. That's, in my view, the challenge. Which is why my conclusion is that when we talk about sustainable intensification of agriculture in Europe, the emphasis has to be on the sustainability word rather than the intensity word. So, in my view, sustainable intensification means finding a development path which simultaneously improves productivity and environmental management of agricultural land. And in a way, there's nothing new about that. This is just simply a pair of words which has come into common usage in the last few years, but it's, in a sense, repeating messages that we've been talking about for a long time. Sorry, that's jumped again. So it's a goal and it's an aspiration, and here's the key, that it requires more knowledge intensity. We have to be more knowledgeable about all of the impacts of what we're doing when we're cultivating agricultural land. So it has to be more knowledge intensive and integrated. If we deconstruct the two words a little more, I find it fascinating that intensity is a ratio. We can measure the intensity of agriculture either as inputs per hectare or outputs per hectare. We can talk about fertilizers or pesticide use. We nearly always focus on the inputs, or at least the enemies of agriculture always focus on the inputs which are potentially, notice my language, environmentally damaging. I mean, not all fertilizers is environmentally damaging. Fertilizers are essential for plant nutrition, whether it comes from mineral sources or organic sources. But intensity is a well-measured, well-known, well-defined concept. I don't find anywhere that intensive agriculture, apart from the farming community itself, is a term of praise. The word has become intensive agriculture is denigrated. So it's well-defined and measurable, but popularly denigrated. When people speak about intensive or industrial agriculture, they're usually throwing criticism and insults at farmers. They're talking about destroying the earth and torturing animals. I mean, to make the language more extreme. So there's a problem about the word intensity, a problem about the language, because I'm suggesting that we have to further intensify our agriculture. That's the diagnosis, and yet the word is not happily received. I think we have to broaden the way we look at agriculture. We should talk about all of its the potential outputs on the same basis. We only ever use the word production to refer to the production of saleable food and energy and other such products. We don't talk about production of conservation outputs of agricultural management. It's a pity. Agriculture does provide a whole range of eco-services in addition to food and energy, and we should use the word production to them as well, although I don't see much hope of doing that. So intensification, I think, is clearly defined. It should apply to conservation outputs per hectare as well as agricultural outputs per hectare. In many parts of Europe, I think the sustainable intensification path should be to be producing more of the non-food services per hectare: carbon sequestration, flood protection, biodiversity, lapwings per hectare. There's a lot of ratios of intensity where the management of land, the challenge is to increase those ratios, intensify in that direction. But whichever direction sustainable intensification takes us on, knowledge per hectare is the key, knowing how to do it better. And that knowledge will be embodied in the capital of agriculture. That's not just the machinery, but the genetics of our plants and animals, and in the way we manage and treat them. So the knowledge will be embodied in the capital, in the labour and the management. The task, in a way, if you accept the diagnosis that knowledge intensification or sustainable intensification is the way forward, the task is to detoxify or destigmatise the word intensity. And I think that's quite a strong challenge. Now, in contrast, the word sustainable, I've never met anybody who's not in favour of it. Everybody wants everything to be sustainable. It's a much loved concept. The trouble is, we've no idea what it means, how to measure it. This is where I always revert to the Brundtland definition: meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Unsustainable systems undermine their own indefinite continuation. Now, that use of the word sustainability and sustainable, to my mind, is getting horribly diluted. When something is described as non-sustainable, it often means it contains something that I don't much like. And I think that use of the term is not very helpful. Sustainability is nearly always described as three-dimensional. It has an economic, environmental, and social dimension. Farmers like to argue that if the economic dimension is not met, if farms are not viable, you won't get any environmental delivery. And I understand that argument. But equally, the environmentalists will say, if you're destroying the very basis of your production system, it won't be viable for very long. I don't think it helps to try and argue that one is more important than the other. I think what matters is that we get a better fix on what any of them mean. To my mind, and this is one of my critical points, is that if you take the definition literally, it implies the existence of limits or thresholds or tipping points. A system which is unsustainable has reached or is about to reach some kind of threshold beyond which some kind of irreversible change in the production conditions is happening, which prevent the continuation of that system. Now, to my mind, this is an important concept. There's a line of research which talks about planetary boundaries and suggests that the human race is already beyond and is approaching several of these planetary boundaries. And therefore, what we're doing in the world is unsustainable, which is a pretty serious message if it's true. And obviously with climate change, if we get a climate change above 2 degrees this century, it's said that that will unlock some irreversible changes in weather patterns, which will have enormous negative impacts. And my concern is that despite these sorts of pronouncements, there's almost no research on what the nature of these irreversibilities or what these thresholds are, or identification of how close we are to them. And I think that's a serious problem. Now, having introduced the concept of sustainable intensification, does it describe a way forward for agriculture? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It's a prescription of a general approach. It does not define a specific answer. Here's a very simple production possibility frontier between environmental services from farming and food and energy on the vertical axis. And we expect that we're mostly operating in the first top right quadrant, where we're producing positive amounts of both. I would suggest that there are plenty of people who suggest that some agriculture is operating in the zone of producing food and energy, positive food and energy outputs, and degrading natural capital, and it's therefore operating in the negative quadrant. And if that's the allegation, and therefore we should be moving into that quadrant. Now, generally speaking, a highly virtuous sustainable intensification development path is shown by arrow A, where you both improve the productivity of agriculture and the output of environmental services. It may be that for some farms or farming systems or regions, we have to move in the direction C, improving the environmental services whilst maintaining agricultural output. Or for others, it may be there's little scope to increase environmental outputs, but we could improve their productivity for agricultural outputs. So you can see that there's multiple paths, and which path any particular farm or farming region should be on depends on their initial situation and the characteristics of the region and the problems that it's creating. You see that path D there is a trade-off where we sacrifice some environmental services to produce more agricultural output. E is the reverse, where you de-intensify agriculture, the less agricultural output per hectare and more environmental outputs. One version of that would be conversion from conventional to organic farming. And I've shown the organic farming as further to the right from conventional farming, but less productive. And I think that broadly speaking, you understand why I've done that. My point is, there isn't a single diagnosis about in which direction to move. Now, let me pose a question. How much of EU agriculture is unsustainable? Is is all European agriculture perfectly sustainable? We could continue doing what we're presently doing indefinitely. And I suspect if you talk to most farmers, they would start with the presumption, yep, none of my farm is unsustainable. It's all perfectly, it can carry on forever. Is all of European agriculture unsustainable? Well, if you read some commentators, you would think that's certainly the flavour they give. I think the answer is some. Some of European agriculture is unsustainable, but the important thing is to specify a bit more precisely, a lot more precisely, in what way. Let me make two broad, a very simplified, oversimplified fragmentation of European agriculture, or partition, into two types. I would suggest that there's a lot of commercial European agriculture where the environmental sustainability is questioned. I didn't say that it is unsustainable. There is certainly a problem of soil erosion. There's certainly a problem of declining fertility. There is a measured indices of declining soil organic matter. There's water pollution problem. Again, that's clearly documented. In some regions, it's becoming less of a problem because we're taking action. In other regions, it's still getting worse. There is certainly air pollution from greenhouse gases and ammonia, which is not being tackled. And there is certainly degradation to biodiversity and landscape. All of these are the accusations that are posed towards a lot or some commercial agriculture. Do any of them render it unsustainable in the strict meaning of the word, is my question. I don't know the answer to that. And I would suggest that despite a huge amount of research, very few people who conduct research on sustainability come to the conclusion that I've read a lot of studies that say, and this system is unsustainable. They pose the question at the front, but they don't answer it, but by the end. So I'm letting that thought hang. There's another big sector of European agriculture, big in the amount of land it occupies, probably approaching half of the land area, is classified as less favoured in the European Union. These are marginal farming areas, where the problem there is less, I didn't say not, I said less, the environmental sustainability, it's their economic and social sustainability. These are areas with non-viable holdings, very high dependence on subsidy payments that are threatened, and associated with land and village abandonment. Now, there may be significant areas that embrace, I'm not suggesting all of agriculture is in one or other of these categories, that agriculture is much more complex than that. But what I'm suggesting is that the nature of the unsustainability we need to dig into a bit more. How do we identify the thresholds of environmental unsustainability? Well, clearly, there will be some parts of southern Europe which, if global warming continues and European warming continues, will become unfarmable because of temperature rise and potentially associated water shortage. I mean, that is not inconceivable. I don't know whether we've got areas of Europe where salting is occurring or acid conditions are developing that threatens crop and hence livestock production. There are certainly questions about the loss of soil and organic matter oxidation. How you define thresholds for this is where we haven't made much progress, is my suggestion. There are plenty of warning indicators, and we measure a lot or most of these things. But my suggestion is that there are very few identifiable thresholds. In the project we did for the RISE Foundation, Professor Winfried Blum from Vienna has devised a way of trying to categorize European soils as to whether they have gone past the point of sustainability, and he comes out a figure with, I think it was 5 or 6%, and he identifies these geographically. But I think that sort of work needs extending for other factors as well. Economic sustainability is even more difficult to define. Clearly, it's not a matter of individual business failure. To the individual business, it matters if his business fails. To the nation, it matters less. I didn't say it doesn't matter at all, because if an individual business runs into financial trouble and has to give up, the assets will pass to others. And so this does not pose a threat to food security. It poses a threat to the family whose business has failed, but in a way, in our competitive economies, business failure is part of keeping businesses on their toes. So therefore, the threshold of economic sustainability is not business failure, it's presumably asset or land abandonment, or land that's farmed to destruction. There are not many examples of that, but there are examples of that in other parts of the world. I've mentioned them on the slide. There's plenty of warning indicators: low incomes, non-viable loss-making holdings, high dependence on subsidy. The interesting thing is that in other parts of the economy, if you've got businesses like traditional shipbuilding in Britain that was loss-making, dependent on subsidy, eventually governments pull the rug from it and say we're not subsidising it anymore. We don't do that with farming. Why not? And it seems to me the answer is nearly always environmental or social, which points to the appropriate, I think, policies and diagnosis. I think social unsustainability is even more difficult to define, either the thresholds or the indicators. So what are the development paths for commercial agriculture? It seems to me this is the bad news, that there are some areas and farming systems where the conclusion may be they simply have to reduce intensity of output to reduce the intensity of negative environmental impacts. And I'm thinking particularly of nutrient overload. Now, the Netherlands has gone some way in dealing with this. It's one of the few that has, in actually reducing farm output per hectare, reducing the concentration of production. But there's still a chronic issue there. And in a way, these are extremely difficult to deal with. Why? Because the people who are managing those businesses have not accepted that they're unsustainable. And this is where I think the language starts to get in the way. That they think these businesses can continue indefinitely. It may not be desirable that water's polluted, but we can live with it, and we have done. The difficult issue there, and particularly, when we turn to policy mechanisms, you would say, well, these should be regulated. Well, we have regulation. We've got water regulation, nitrate regulation. We simply don't enforce it. It's been in place for a long time. And we pay for compliance with that regulation. We've been paying farmers for compliance with this regulation for a decade now, since 2014, explicitly, with very little impact on some of these indices. So we've got a problem here. However, I think that category is relatively small. I don't know how big. For most of commercial agriculture, this is a matter of reducing negative externalities and increasing positive externalities. And in a way, that's been the debate for the last 15 or 20 years, how to arrange the incentives to bring about that behaviour, to get us onto what you'd describe as a sustainable development path. Now, in my moments of optimism, and I'm coming towards the sort of bit towards the future about knowledge intensification, in my moments of optimism, I see data like this. This came from some German study. This shows the variability of yield and the variability of biodiversity, very crudely measured, numbers of plant species, on a series of plots in Germany. And not unsurprisingly, there's tremendous variation in both dimensions. That for any level of agricultural productivity, there's a huge variation, a five-fold variation in biodiversity. Or for any level of biodiversity, there's a 2- or 4-fold variation in agricultural productivity. And it's the existence of that variation that gives me hope that if we understood more about why some highly productive farms are also more biodiverse, or why some highly biodiverse farms are also productive, and we understood more about that, what causes that variability and how much of it can be managed, this is where the knowledge comes in, we can encourage more of our production to move towards that frontier in the virtuous direction. I think the development paths for marginal agriculture I'm going to skip. Why are we struggling with this concept? I think it's because environmentalists misinterpret intensity and they see it only in negative terms, and farmers are not convinced that their farming is unsustainable. So there's a fundamental, in a sense, evidence gap on both sides. And as far as the unsustainability is concerned, my suggestion is that because there's very little convincing evidence to show that farmers are wrong in thinking that what they're doing is sustainable, then there's, and this is because there's almost no attention to specifying environmental limits. So here's my messages for knowledge intensification, my two favorite things that we need to be doing. I think we have to push much harder the real meaning of the word sustainable. Use it less in the direction of trying to improve environmental performance, and there's nothing wrong with that, more in the direction of detecting or distinguishing between systems which truly are unsustainable, cannot continue indefinitely, and systems which probably could. In other words, to understand and characterize the limits. And this is an issue both of conceptualization as well as empirical identification. And I think the work that Blum did on soils is indicative of a way of going about this, but it has to be done for all the environmental media in addition to soils, and preferably at the farm or field level. Because it seems to me that if an individual land manager knew or was informed that what he's doing is not capable of continuation for more than a decade or two, in other words, it threatens the lives of his children or grandchildren, I think most of them will pay attention, or might. So the question is, at what, if any, point in soil erosion, organic matter decline, phosphorus concentration, temperature rise, precipitation, fall in precipitation, loss of pollinators or other biodiversity, which of these threaten productivity? Is there any way of determining this? At the moment, the nearest thing we've got to limits are regulatory limits. It's nitrates in water and the condition of our water systems. And those regulatory limits were largely politically determined and are presumably thought to be and hoped to be inside the technical limits. That's the first challenge. The second challenge, and this is the point I finish on, is the knowledge exchange challenge. My observation over my career as an agricultural economist is that agricultural economics contributed enormously to farm management economics by developing good measurement and benchmarking of farm economic performance. Every kind of agricultural activity, we have the appropriate measures of productivity which are regularly communicated to farmers. And we've been doing this for a long time now, either through public or private means. And yet we've hardly started to do that on environmental performance. So farmers who are commercially minded and who go and look at this sort of literature know how to improve the performance of their dairy herd. And they've got lots of indicators to help them do it. The policy towards agriculture has changed its emphasis in the last 20 years to emphasize environmental land management, but the management information to help farmers do that has not kept up with that. And so I think that I mean, apart from energy efficiency and perhaps water use efficiency, and we're beginning to now start measuring greenhouse gas emissions and communicate that at farm level, we have to extend and broaden that kind of work to provide usable indicators and benchmarks of performance at farm level. And it does seem to me that I mean, I've been suggesting this for a long time, that our farm accountancy data network, which is the core data set at farm level in Europe, still doesn't embrace this and really ought to. So my conclusions are sustainable intensification is a useful globally based concept for a better balance between food production and the environment. The EU emphasis has to be to maintain agricultural productivity growth, about which I've said very little, and it's not because I don't think it's important, I just focused on these other issues, but there has to be a step change in environmental performance. And if we're going to stick to using the word sustainability, I think we have to do more research on identifying and communicating the existence and location of thresholds at the farm level, which is missing knowledge. And this means benchmarking farm environmental performance in a way that is comprehensible to farmers. And now I'm sure we're going to hear in the other presentations people who are doing exactly this. Thank you for your attention.